feel like this year has changed a lot in the NFL. Scoring's down. Obviously, curious how that has affected like the DFS environment for you, and how should we like be adjusting like our strategy going forward with like basically we've had multiple weeks in a row now where the chalk has completely failed, and a lot of that has to do with a lot of these games just being really low scoring.
Normally, there's like nothing new under the sun in the world of DFS. Like there's very few angles that you're going to mention that no one else has mentioned. But I have not heard this be a big talking point in the DFS content that I engage with, which is that scoring is way down. Last year, I believe the average final score of a game was like 52. This year, it's like 46, and might even be lower, because I saw that a couple weeks ago. It might even be lower now. And the question I wanted to pose to you is, does stacking really lose its efficacy, especially in terms of like the double stack, double bring back stuff, if so many of these games are going low and teams are running fewer plays, teams are gaining fewer yards? That means, fewer completions for the PPR stuff. And so does it kind of come back to the play the best plays stuff, or it not just like, oh, I'm literally going to play the best points per dollar guys, but kind of picking and choosing like, oh, this one off, that one off, this one off, that one off, for lineup context?
Honestly, I think it might be an argument in favor of the opposite. I think that stacking more in these situations, because if you do pick that game that does go over, right, there's a lot more value in that, because there's like typically going to be a spot that everyone likes that is going to go under, right? Like we just saw it a couple weeks ago with the Chiefs-Cowboys game. Like I think there's always value in finding a game that is a little bit low, not low, but lower than like the top tier, and like trying to figure out if there's at least a scenario where that game can go under. I get what you're saying, but it's still like a similar problem, right? We're still trying to find these guys in situations where they could go off. If there's less scoring to go around, I actually think that you lean into correlation a little bit more. It's also an argument in favor of playing smaller field tournaments like we always talk about, right? Because you don't need that high score anyway. You keep seeing Leone on these weeks where the chalk fails just completely smash, and he's leaning pretty heavily into correlation, and he's not afraid to lose, man. We always talk about it, but don't be afraid to lose. Don't be afraid to play these guys in smaller field tournaments that no one has.
Yeah. That's literally the secret to why Leone keeps binking, is because he's not afraid to be the only guy in the Thunderdome with Ben Roethlisberger and Pat Freiermuth, like literally the only guy in there. And he's just not afraid. He's just not afraid to like refresh the screen and be like, well, I'm stone dead, and so I just lost that money and I'll never get it back. Like it is definitely one of those things. You just got to be comfortable losing.
It's been like so valuable, I think, to talk to those guys on Sunday morning too, because there's times where I'm sitting there like, okay, I have to figure out a way to get CMC in, because I don't want to sit here and watch the 40 ball, right? And then I get in with Peter and Leone, and they're just like not even considering him, right? Like they're looking at some of these top projected plays and they're just Xing them out in certain roster constructions, right? So it definitely depends on what type of lineup you're trying to build. But I think I've gotten better just by listening to those guys, because they're not scared, like you said, to be the only guy that's willing to play certain stuff in certain smaller field contests. So yeah, I wasn't on the Ben stuff, and honestly, the Ben stuff didn't really even do that well. It was just a week where everything else failed, so there was value in being able to pass people when stuff kind of went wrong in that way. But I guess the lower scoring stuff, do you think that has any impact on certain positions as well? Like the first thing that comes to mind for me, just at least recency bias, is like paying up for tight ends right now just seems absolutely horrendous, because like the team totals are not high enough for these guys to get there unless they score, and you can get that from anyone. You don't have to pay up for George Kittle, right? And every time I pay up at tight end, I literally get buried every single time, but I still do it, man. I talk myself into it every week.
Every single time. Yeah, paying up for tight end, and also even paying up for like mid-tier safety, like Dallas Goedert types. Yep. I know Gronk like broke the slate yesterday, so that's a weird example.
That's like more what I mean though. The mid-range guys are almost worse in some ways, right? Because they're the same as the guys that are punt guys.
Yeah, there's not really a difference between Pat Freiermuth and CJ Uzomah. It's that if Uzomah scores a touch, and you could argue like Freiermuth's touchdown probability is slightly higher, but their distribution of results is going to be really similar, which is one guy, whichever guy scores the touchdown is going to end up being fine. So I think it really does impact the tight end position. I also think it does the converse at quarterback though, where it makes the the Cam Newton, Tyrod Taylor. I think Tua had a fine game yesterday, but like the Tua guys, because those guys have like no access to 30 plus point games, whereas Mahomes, Lamar, Josh Allen, like those guys have access to 30+ point games.
Sure.
Tom Brady, which ends up being pretty big. And I wonder also if the math on paying up for defense is a little bit different with some of these teams just like delivering these insane point totals. Like the Patriots defense sucked yesterday relative to what they expected. I think they got 14 in the end. So I wonder if paying up for defense is maybe a little bit exploitable right now.
Could be. The defense thing, it's like, what do you win when you actually get it right? Like, because like what defense actually smashes, we have Cincinnati gets 19 points. Like when you think about it that way, like you're differentiating maybe like a touchdown from some of your other roster positions. So at that point, I don't know. I still like having the late swap flexibility with defense.
When that matters a lot when the points are low, right?
That's true.
So like if the winning score on FanDuel in that dime contest you play is 144, that 5-point difference of defense like might be the bonk.
That could be what almost got me there, right? Like, so I was 1.4 away from cashing this, and I did have Cincinnati on that team. So maybe I was underselling, I guess, how valuable that was on this roster for sure, because they were pretty close to the stone min. They were like 3,300. They were just very, very chalky. One thing that I think is interesting about defense, though, and it kind of leads me into my last point on this, is that basically, if you ended up playing the chalk DraftKings defense on FanDuel, maybe it was the Dolphins, you were doing great because everyone on FanDuel had either Cincinnati or Houston, something like that. Just like playing that like slight price pivot based on which site you're playing on, I think is kind of sharp.
So good.
And I was, because like we run into that with the positions too, but I like it especially at defense. And like the last thing that I wanted to mention too, on the Leone front is that I hear him like kind of talking through his lineup. He did have Cordero Patterson on it, and just going down, looking at guys that have ceiling, and you can see the clear top tier because it's usually pretty lateral with ownership. And there's always like one or two guys that stand out as being like 10% or lower. And those are guys that make sense to build mini stacks around, to build in like your one-offs versus just like jamming in Chris Godwin as a one-off at 25%. Like that's really bad.
Yeah, no, that you do make an interesting point. Like that can be like a skeleton key. Like I really like running back X this week because I think he has a lot of in-game ceiling, and wide receiver Y on the other team doesn't have a ton of ownership. He's priced similarly to guys who are going to be really popular, and he's got a path to 9 targets and like a good upside game. So like that, because a lot of the times when we open up the screens, we're just like, well, who do we play? Like, like I know I like these 4 guys, but how do I fill out the other position? So it's like giving our lizard brains, something to attach, which I think is helpful and useful.
You think this affects late swap at all? These like low scoring slates, just this low scoring NFL in general, because sometimes there's really like a lot of value in these guys like Adam Thielen, who we know is going to have the same role no matter what. And he's going to come in at super low ownership at times.
Guys.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So that's like even more valuable if you grab a couple touchdowns, if there's not going to be many of them to go around, right? If you're trying to jam in, and sorry to bring up, I guess the past, but a guy like Jamison Crowder, who's like going to dink and dunk up the field, super low total, he's not going to separate,
to play
right?
That guy.
That's what I'm saying.
So bad to play that guy. Yeah. Just like it, like I know Visca had like terrible results yesterday, but at least LaVisca like has the ability to like score some touchdowns. Even on like he could score a touchdown. He gets 2 targets in a game, but one of them is a 65-yard touchdown or something.
Yeah, so I think my takeaway is maybe in late swap really try and focus a little bit more on not even just ceiling, just like legit touchdown scores. Because if you run into that game that's even popular, but you grab the 1 or 2 touchdowns that comes from it and it goes under, like that's super valuable at low ownership when you're trying to catch all these guys that may have PMR or may have had a much better start than you did.